This right here is Saryn. And Saryn, as many of you know, is a little bit infamous for being one of the most broken Warframes since sliced bread. And you know what? Now, in 2026, she even lost her last remaining weakness, Survivability. So, in this Warframe guide, I have prepared multiple updated Saryn 2026 builds for you to absolutely annihilate everything. Big shout out to all our generous channel members, and now, let's jump right into it. Alright, so before we jump in, just a quick info from my side. I'm currently recovering from a little surgery. Nothing crazy or anything, don't worry. It's just that I can currently not really sit comfortably for long times, which is why the next few videos might have a bit less editing than usual, so I can just finish them faster and get out of the office. Hope you don't mind, and with that being said, let's first take a look at Saryn's abilities. But okay, abilities. As per usual, let's start out with the passive, which is a very quick affair. Status effects inflicted by Saryn, either with weapons or with abilities, last 25% longer. That's a very nice passive buff. Ability number 1 is called Spores, and this one is really good. What it does is, when you walk to an enemy, you aim at them, and then you can cast the spores onto the enemy. As you can see right here, you now have these growths on the enemy, which are the spores. These spores will then deal damage over time that constantly ramps up, and if you want to see how much damage over time, then you can see that in the bottom right of your screen. This thing has no duration and will stack up forever as long as there is at least one infected enemy left. Now, the thing is, these spores can also spread. You can either spread one spore to all surrounding enemies if you shoot it directly. Excuse me? Yeah, there we go. Now every enemy has that one spore on them. However, if you take out the enemy completely that has multiple spores on them, then all the spores on the enemy will spread to the enemies around them. The only exception here is if the spores themselves kill an enemy with a damage over time, then they won't spread. So it needs to be any other source that takes them out. And then there's another little fun fact, which is if you activate her third ability, about which we're going to talk in just a second, then just normally hitting the enemy body will also instantly transmit all the spores on them to everybody around. So yeah, that's a nice synergy. Let's just say spores are really good. Now, to be 100% fair, the damage over time that comes from the spores is really nothing to write home about in Steel Path. You can already see it here, right? They're basically not dealing damage whatsoever. In normal Starshot, it's a different thing. In normal Starshot, they're actually really good for room clearing. In Steel Path, though, they gain another nice quality, which is armor stripping, because they inflict corrosive status effects, and that means you can basically armor strip the entire room passively over time. Now, Spores also has augments, not just one, it actually has two, and out of those, one is very good and one is situational at best. First of all, let's talk about revealing Spores. This one will mark affected enemies on the radar in a 40-meter radius. The good thing here is that it is an Exilus mod, so it doesn't clog up your build, but still I'm not sure if this is really all that necessary, given the fact that the damage numbers themselves kinda sorta already reveal the rough location of enemies around you. However, what is much more interesting, and actually a mod that I use on every one of my Saryn builds, would be Venom Dose. This one is pretty simple. It gives you the option to hold cast Spores, which will then infuse corrosive damage on your weapon, scaling with ability strength. So yeah, not much more to say here. Given the fact that Saryn is already a very good weapons platform, that skill is, basically something that I use on any one of my builds, and I can highly recommend it. Ability number 2, Molt. This one, if you ask me, is a little bit hit or miss. At base, what it does is relatively straightforward. If you press the ability, you basically shed your skin and create a sort of doppelganger in the position that you're currently in. A few seconds after the cast, you will significantly increase your movement speed, which makes it sorta a nice mobility tool if you have enough energy to spam it. However, the main reason for this is to be used as a temporary distraction on something like a shield gating build. Let me showcase. If we now have the enemies shoot at me, which they don't do because they're already showcasing what I was about to say, that the enemies prioritize shooting at your clone right here, that is a nice distraction, and on shield gating builds, you use this to regain your shield with brief respite whenever you take a hit, and then it temporarily distracts the enemy until they finally destroy the thing. So yeah, that is basically the main use of Molt. If you want to go for shield gating, this is a great tool, especially because the ability itself has 0 casting time, so Brief Respite will instantly get triggered. However, for any other type of build that doesn't go for shield gating, it is at max a nice temporary mobility tool. Now, there's also an augment with Molt called Regenerative Mold, but this one, in my opinion, isn't really all that applicable in most cases. What it does is pretty simple. After casting Mold, you will temporarily heal yourself for quite a lot of health per second. The problem here is, though, that, as we previously established, Mold is usually used on shield gating builds and shield gating builds only, and as it is the nature of shield gating builds, you don't really care about your HP gain per second. So, in my opinion, I would just not recommend using this, but I'm sure some of you in the comments will point out the occasional use case. Ability number 3 is called Toxic Lash, and this one, oh boy, this is one of the most broken abilities in the game, always has been and probably always will be. At first glance, what it does seems relatively simple. It infuses toxin on all your weapons. However, if we take a closer look, then what we see is that it is actually not an infusion, but rather an imbuement. The difference here is that if you have an infusion, which is the usual case, then what Toxic Lash would do is it basically adds toxin damage right into here into your weapon stats, and the game is going to treat it as if you just added toxin onto the weapon. However, Toxic Lash is an imbuement, and imbuments work a little bit differently. An imbuement is essentially a second imaginary bullet that gets fired for every normal bullet that you fire. You will see this by the white damage numbers with the force toxin procs next to them. These damage numbers are not really coming from the weapon itself, but they are basically coming out of nowhere for every weapon hit and deal a percentage of the weapon damage in the form of pure toxin. One of the reasons why this is so good is that these additional damage instances, the elemental imbuements, they don't double dip, they actually triple dip on damage over time effects with faction damage, so that is really darn strong. Plus, there are also some very funky interactions with a specific shotgun that we all know and love if you use Toxic Lash, because then you're gonna get something like this here. An explosion that deals crazy AoE damage and even more explosions and nukes the entire room. And if you have never seen this before, then don't worry, we're gonna have a build later showcasing how exactly that works. Toxic Lash also has an augment called Contagion Cloud, which basically deals a toxin cloud that inflicts a bit of damage over time in a small AoE. However, also with this one, I don't want to get too deep into it in this video because it is, in my opinion, niche at best. We're not going to use it today. And last but not least, we have a relatively simple and straightforward ability, but a nice one nonetheless, and that would be Miasma. What it does is very simple. When you cast it, all the enemies in its AoE will briefly be stunned and will take a bit of damage over time and eat a guaranteed viral status proc. One status proc per cast, so it is a little bit restrictive when it comes to viral priming. The cool thing about this is that if enemies have spores on them, let's quickly spread some, if enemies have spores on them, then when you hit Miasma, then these spores will deal 4 times the damage, which usually, in a normal star chart content, will basically instantly nuke the room, but then again in Steel Path, as we previously established, you can cast Miasma all the time as much as you want, you're not really gonna see it affect on enemy health bars. However, it is still a somewhat nice tool to at least inflict a little bit of viral in an AoE. Overall though, I should say when it comes to Saryn's abilities, then Spores and Toxic Lash are an absolute must-have for every build. However, both Mold as well as Miasma can potentially be replaced with something else from the Helminth, depending on what your build requires. And as always, if you could leave a quick like for the video, that would be really helpful with the YouTube algorithm, so cheers so much for your support. But alright, so much for Saryn's skills. Before we jump into the builds themselves though, I first want to talk about the big elephant in the room, and for Saryn, that is survivability. I don't want to stretch this out for all too long, but the main issue with her has kinda sorta always been staying alive. Not that it was impossible or anything, I'm just saying that there are definitely more survivable Warframes out there. However though, in 2026, this is no longer an issue anymore. In fact, we actually have the free choice on which type of survivability we want. We can shield tank with her, we can go for shield gating, and even though health tanking has always sort of been an option, now it basically makes her completely invincible. So let me show you how each of these three methods work. To showcase this, I have prepared a second Saryn without any upgrades or any investment, where I'm just going to show you the upgrades that you can use in order to achieve these three goals. Starting out, we do with the shield tanking version. As we probably know, shields have a 50% damage reduction against basically everything by default, only exception being Toxin. On top of this 50% innate damage reduction, we then put adaptation, which is a bit difficult to quantify, but I usually estimate this to be an average of 66% damage reduction. We then go for primed redirection to get over 1,000 shields, which is pretty nice. And one thing that is very nice with the shield tanking setup would be something like Arcane Aegis, which can lead to constant shield regeneration. That is a very good option. Alternatively though, you could go for the Rakta Dark Dagger as well, with something like this here for example, because the Rakta Dark Dagger has a passive skill that recharges your shields. I'm not going to go too deep into the details on this here, I have a separate build video on just the Rakta Dark Dagger alone. Just saying, it's very difficult to die if you play Saryn with this dagger and Arcane Aegis on top. However though, if you wanted to be even tankier, then one alternative to think about would be to use a Helminth ability for more tankiness too. You know, something like Mirage's Eclipse or Nova's Null Star. However though, if you don't want to shield tank, but rather you want to go very high and you want to shield gate against level cap enemies, or at least long endurance, then this right here would be an optional setup with a bit of mix and match involved. The main thing that we do here is using catalyzing shields to reduce our maximum shields down to just 74. This way, we can use Molt as our shield gating ability, which is very convenient because it is one of the very few abilities in the game that has 0 casting time. You press the button and then Brief Respite will instantly fill your shields up completely. However, in order to not have to constantly recast Molt every time your shield breaks, what you could do is incorporate Fast Deflection as well as Vigilante Vigor, which will give you so much shield recharge delay and so much shield recharge percentage that it is sort of not even necessary anymore to use Molt in the first place. Don't get me wrong, it's not 100% invincibility, there will be the occasional damage instance that goes down to your health, but it is pretty safe. The Rolling Guard that I incorporated here, that is just an option. You don't really 100% have to do this because you're able to shield gate with Molt and Brief Respite already. However though, if you know me, and if you've been a subscriber of the channel for a long time, then you know that I really don't like shield gating. So let's talk about the brand new survivability method, and this one makes her borderline invincible. Just as a side note here, I'm probably not the first one to find it out, it's almost been half a year since the release of this Arcane, but it still is a very good combination. What we do here is, we use Arcane Persistence. This one limits the damage taken per second to 500 damage per second at max. So if this is on, you can never lose more than 500 HP per second. Only requirement here is that you have at least 700 armor, and you cannot be in a nullifier bubble, and you cannot be affected by magnetic. The good thing here is that Saryn, at least the Prime version, has just enough base armor to be able to get her to over 700. Unfortunately, the normal Saryn does not quite make the cut, where you would have to use one Archon shard in order to surpass the 700 threshold. And then for the mods, I went for triple Umbral in this specific showcase here because they synergize very well with one another. However, you don't need to do that for your build. Double Umbral is more than enough, as you can see here. Even if we drop the Umbral Vitality and just replace it with, normal Vitality, we lose out on some health, we lose out on some armor, but we're still over 700, and that is what matters. But now, let's finally talk about the builds. And as per usual, the first thing we want to talk about is Helminth and Archon Shards. So let's talk about the Helminth options. And the cool thing is, when it comes to Saryn, we have a ton of options. First of all, if you want to go for shield tanking and therefore need damage reduction, Mirage's Eclipse is your first option, and Nova's Null Star would be the second option, both giving you 75% damage reduction. Then another very great and popular option would be Xata's Whisper from Zaku, and we're also going to have a build for this later, which gives you void damage imbuement on your weapon. Yes, you heard right, I said imbuement, not infusion, because Xata's Whisper works exactly the same way as I previously explained how Toxic Lash works, which means that you have this double dipping and these crazy synergies with the Sobek that we're also going to talk about, just ×2 from Toxic Lash and Xata's Whisper at the same time. Then, another thing that is kind of counterintuitive at first, but actually pretty good, would be Nourish. It, on the one hand, solves all your energy issues, and as I previously said, given that Miasma or 4 isn't really all that great for viral priming, Nourish is just the better viral option here. Then, another one of my favorite would be Cyto 9 Evade. As we said, Saryn's traditional biggest issue has always been survivability, and being invisible is very helpful when it comes to survival. As for the final one that I want to mention, this would be Gloom from Sebagoth. I've quickly gone over this in the survivability section of the video previously, and we're also going to have a build later on for this, but basically, if you use Gloom, in combination with a new arcane that limits your health loss per second, it is basically impossible to ever die. It's super broken and I absolutely love it. As for the Archon Shards, here I first gotta make one big disclaimer. Due to the fact that my Saryn is used to showcase multiple builds for multiple videos, I cannot really focus to min-max on one specific setup. That's the reason why my shards look very colorful. One thing though that I would recommend for every Saryn player would be either 1 Tau Forged green or 2 normal greens into increasing the cap of corrosive procs per enemy. With 1 Tau Forge, you can have a maximum of 13 procs on an enemy, which equals 98% armor reduction, but with 2 normals you can get it up to 14, which is 100%. In my opinion, 98% is just fine, and I wouldn't want to sacrifice 2 Archon Shard slots just for that additional 2%, but hey, you do you. Then another option that I really liked was using blue Archon Shards for more maximum energy. Especially on the Prime, you come with pretty good energy to begin with, and you can sort of get around having to use a flow mod by just using some Archon Shards to do that. Other options that would be nice would of course be red Archon Shards into more ability duration or more ability strength, yellow Archon Shards into more casting speed, which is always convenient, but you can also use green shards to increase your ability damage on enemies affected by corrosive. But if you want to go for a gun platform using a secondary weapon, you might as well go for something like Topaz Archon Shards, increasing your crit chance on pistols, and if you go for a melee Saryn, then definitely don't miss out on the purple ones, which give you more melee crit damage. But now, let's finally look into the builds. And the first one I want to start out with here is the Xata's Whisper build, the most popular one on Saryn, together with the Sobek Acid Shells interaction. First of all, what we do here is, for the survivability, I decided to use shield gating for this one. You personally don't have to go for shield gating here though, so if you wanted to, you could use any of the other survivability templates that I previously showcased in the survivability chapter. As for the rest of the build, it's actually pretty self-explanatory. I go for a lot of ability strength because more ability strength means more corrosive damage from Venom Dose, the infusion of corrosive, more damage from the toxic imbuement coming from Toxic Lash, and more damage coming from the Xata's Whisper imbuement with Void. Then I also add a little bit of duration with Prime Continuity plus the 2 red Archon Shards that you saw earlier, leading me to 175%, which is more than comfortable enough for all these buffs. Energy Sustain comes from Arcane Energize alone, which on this build is usually fine, and also here I don't use Flow because I have 2 blue Archon Shards giving me, just enough energy to come by. However, we're not talking about Saryn if we're not talking about the Kuva Sobek. Before I show you the build on the Sobek though, let me just give you a little glimpse at what we're doing here. We take out one enemy, and then bada bing bada boom, the entire room explodes. That, my dear friends, is the power of Saryn in combination with the Sobek. First of all, this Sobek build in general doesn't matter all too much. The only mod that is really required for this interaction to work is Acid Shells. The rest of the build you just use whatever you like, it just needs to be good enough to kill an enemy, the rest doesn't matter. What Acid Shells does is, when you take out an enemy, then 45% of this enemy's maximum health is being dealt as a corrosive AoE in a 15-meter radius to other enemies. This in and of itself is nothing special, as you can also see here, which quickly take out one enemy, and you saw some damage numbers right there, but the AoE in total just barely scratches the enemies, right? Acid Shells by default is a very weak and unuseful mod. However, the kicker here is that these additional AoE damage instances that you see here, these are considered in the game code as if they were direct hits from the weapon themselves. Which means if we use an imbuement like Toxic Lash and Xata's Whisper, then every one of those damage instances will inherit Xata's Whisper and Toxic Lash, which is a lot of damage. As you can also see here, right? The AoE of Acid Shells itself isn't really what makes it strong. What makes it strong is that this AoE sort of taxis the very strong effects of both of these skills. It's nothing new, it's nothing revolutionary, but what would be a Saryn video without showcasing the sobek? But let's next talk about one of my other favorite builds, and that would be Invisible Saryn. First of all, as previously mentioned in the Helminth section, we use Evade from Side 09 to become invisible. Then, because we are invisible, we don't really care about survivability because ideally we're not going to get hit in the first place. That is why I only added Rolling Guard for those big oopsie moments, and also Prime Sure-Footed so that I don't get knocked down by something like explosive AoEs or something. To give my weapons a bit more crit, I decided to go for Arcane Avenger, but because we're invisible and therefore rarely taking a hit, we have to combine Arcane Avenger with Combat Discipline, otherwise this one will barely ever trigger. If, however, you don't want to go for Arcane Avenger, then the Aura slot is completely open and you could go for something like Growing Power for more ability strength. Also for this build, we add a lot of ability strength so that our buffs from Toxic Lash as well as Spores deal more damage on the weapon. Just one note here, the reason why I go for Archon Intensify is that Evade not only makes us invisible, but also heals us for every kill, and that means we get 60% ability strength from this one. However though, if you don't go for Arcane Avenger, therefore not needing Combat Discipline, then Archon Intensify will rarely ever trigger, in which case I would recommend going for Umbral Intensify instead. Where is it? There. The reason though why I said that invisibility is not purely defensive is Arcane Crepuscular. This one gives us a bit of additional ability strength, which is definitely welcome, but mainly it gives us a final plus 3x crit damage multiplier. But that is still not it. Just as an example here, for this build, I quickly chose the Perigale Prime. You can of course use it with any weapon that you like. What I mean to show here though would be Spectral Serration. This one is like normal Serration, just that it gives twice the damage, which is pretty ridiculous. Only requirement to be able to use this is that you have to be invisible, which is the second reason why being invisible is not purely defensive, because it allows you to use a base damage mod that is twice as strong as the regular. And last, but definitely not least, let's talk about the brand new 2026 synergy, the absolutely invincible health tanking Saryn. What we do right here is we use Gloom from Sevagoth. Just a quick recap in case you skipped the previous chapters, what Gloom does is, enemies in the Gloom AoE get slowed by a lot, and you get healed for a portion of the damage that you're dealing to affected enemies, both with abilities as well as with weapons. What this means is, if we have Spores on the enemies and they deal damage over time, then for each and every one of these damage over time ticks, we will get healed by round about 15% of the damage with this build. In other words, if we have 2 or 3 enemies in the AoE with Spores, that's usually enough to basically heal us for a lot per second. Now, you might wonder, why is this interaction so important? And the reason for that is Arcane Persistence. This one makes it that, if we have at least 700 armor, then we cannot ever lose more than 500 health per second. In other words, if you manage to heal more than 500 health per second, then you are effectively completely unkillable. And guess what? With the Spores as well as Gloom, it is very, very easy to get to more than 500 heal per second. Now, I don't want to explain everything with this interaction again here, because I already told you everything about it in the survivability section earlier in the video, so let's just look at the normal build. Aura as well as Exilus are pretty much free choice, I though really like preparation on this one because it starts me with maximum energy so I can have Gloom run right from the start of the mission. My energy income comes from Equilibrium, which makes it very easy to stay basically constantly full. And then the rest is a lot of ability strength to deal more damage with the Spores as well as Toxic Lash, but also to get a big slow effect as well as lifesteal. And lastly, I also decided to use Stretch because we get a little bit more range for both the Spores to spread as well as also to have a bigger AoE on Gloom. This though is not 100% necessary, and if you wanted to use something else here, 100% range on this build is also just fine. Please just don't make it too big, because if the Gloom AoE is crazy high, then it costs just way too much energy per second to sustain. Also, if you have more Umbra format to spare, then of course go for Umbral Vitality over normal Vitality here. I personally just can't afford it on this build. And Arcane Blessing is kind of optional too, because technically the amount of health that we have with the heal that we expect would be enough to stay alive. I just really like to have some additional health just for safety reasons. Overall though, this health tanking approach is probably my favorite Saryn build of 2026 so far, though it is of course not 100% bulletproof. However, I still believe that if you pay enough attention to what's going on screen and you try to evade the occasional Jade Light Eximus, then it should be relatively easy to keep this effect up for like 99% of the time in most missions. And if you like Saryn as a gun buffer, then you will also love my updated Harrow right here. Another massive shoutout to Niels V, Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nostendix Gaming, Turtle Pier, Undercanio 2, Skylar Bowser, Mihawki, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Murasaki, Shadow Lockhart, Han Tagas, Pater Sater, Boomea1, Mr. Games Plays, Zave, Awendai, Azengen, Quax, Henrik5984, Blue Eagle 98, Hearthwield, Everin 8802, Gabriel Tevez, Yaku Ivan Gonzalez, Candy Fox 19, Argentad, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, good loot.